Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at another gaming console this time around, and this time we're talking about the Nintendo 3DS XL. Now what's so crazy about this specific console was the first time I actually went ahead and bought it, this was actually the first 3DS lineup of devices that I owned, including the 2DS. So I had the 3DS XL, I believe before I even bought the 2DS, 2DS XL, or any of the 3DS models. And what I can definitely tell you is that this console is really worth it in so many different ways, and I can't really think of any situation where this console really isn't worth it, to be honest. And I say that to say this console is the last generation of the DS lineup, and I don't think the DS lineup is ever coming back. So because of that, and because of the capability behind this console, and just the past of this console, as well as some of the future, I mean, there are still some times where games are coming out for this console. They're kind of like games nobody's heard of, but it's still really interesting that a console like this is still somewhat relevant. Now, if you want to pick up the 3DS or 3DS XL, they're available everywhere on eBay. They're starting to go up and down in prices. I mean, they're kind of fluctuate a lot. I believe I paid about $150 for mine, I think in 2017 or 2018, something like that. I think it was 2017. And since then, I've been playing with it every once in a while. I've been playing with, the 3DS a lot more on my third channel. But this console, I think, because it was the last generation pretty much of the 3DS lineup, there really isn't a big question of whether this thing is worth it or not because of the gaming library that this thing has. Now, starting off with the outside, this console originally came out in 2012, so it's actually approaching 10 years old this year, which is so crazy. Now, the design of this thing was, I think, not as good looking as the 3DS on the outside, but the inside, it definitely looked a lot better. So with the outside, you had this kind of like ceramic kind of material up top that looked pretty good. Then you had, dual cameras as well on the front, which I don't really understand why they did that, but still a cool touch. I'm glad they did something like that. Now, flipping this thing open, you immediately get into pretty much all the meat and bones of this specific console. So we still had two displays on this console as expected. So the top display was actually bigger than the bottom display. Now, was that a big deal? Honestly, for the 3DS, I didn't really like it, but for the 3DS XL, I think it actually looks a lot better. And I think with these bigger consoles, a bigger display up top with a smaller display at the bottom kind of gives the impression that it kind of seems like it's kind of like more of like a cinematic experience. So I actually do like that a little bit. Now, the top display was actually pretty decent. It was, I think, 800 by something, and it was actually a pretty decent resolution. The bottom display was a little bit less, big as compared to the bigger display up top, but still it looked pretty good. You had the joystick on the top left corner, you had the D-pad and all, the rest of the buttons throughout, but you also had the, little home, select, and start buttons at the bottom. Now, they were less prominent as compared to the 3DS, so I did actually prefer this way rather than the 3DS buttons, at least the one I have in my opinion. But also on the top right of this console, on the second display, or the bottom right of this display up top, we actually had the 3D toggle. Now, this was the weirder thing about this console. I still don't know why Nintendo decided to go down this route. I mean, it was a marketing ploy more than anything else. And I feel like Nintendo could have done a lot more things than, have a 3D toggle that really very few people used. But it was a marketing gimmick, and I think for the time being, it was actually kind of cool for some people to utilize it. But since then, I mean, the 2DS XL was like the main console they were selling for a long period of time after the 3DS lineup, mostly because it was cheaper to make, and it seemed like more people wanted to go that console, and less people were using that 3D toggle. But this was, I guess, one of the biggest selling factors, at least in the beginning for this specific console. Now, I will tell you personally, I never really utilized that specific display. I didn't really like having that 3D toggle right there. It was very, very strange. It really hurt my head after a little while too, so I never really used it after that point. Now, I will tell you, for most people out there, with getting a console like this, I do think it sits in a very interesting spot with that 3D toggle because it was one of its biggest selling factors. But as of right now, it's like not something I would recommend looking at if you want to go ahead and get a console like this. Now, we had the front camera up top too, which looked great. Headphone jack on this thing, charging port, SD card slot on this thing too, which is really cool. And that kind of covers it up on the outside for the most part. Now, it looks like the 3DS XL actually has the biggest screens of any Nintendo handheld. So what this means is, I guess the Switch isn't really a handheld, even though it kind of is. So this thing had the biggest displays at that time, and even now technically, which I think is really cool. Having a bigger display is awesome, but I also didn't mind the small display on my Nintendo DS Lite either, to be honest. Now, I will tell you, on top of this, the actual UI of this console is still pretty relevant. Although the Switch's UI is probably the best Nintendo has done so far, I still, appreciate things like the Nintendo Wii home screen. I like, this specific, home screen as well. Although the DSi is probably the most impactful that I've seen on any Nintendo handheld. But with this specific UI, still looks great. I mean, you can still access things like certain applications, and you can go on the web browser if you want. You can go to the shop. You can do all sorts of things on this console still, which I think is actually really, really cool. Now, I will tell you, outside of those specific things, the gaming library of this console was insane. There's still so many games available for this console, which is so beautiful. And that is probably one of my, probably one of the most favorite things about this console, in my opinion, with having a console like this, with it having, the gaming library that it has. I mean, stemming back to, I think like 2005 or 2006, whenever the original Nintendo DS came out, it has all of those games available for this console, which is so crazy. So you have a huge array of different games that you can choose from. And I think that in and of itself is one of the greatest selling factors, or one of the reasons to buy this console. I will tell you, if you have, or if you're trying to develop out your own sort of, library of games, you're trying to, build out a collection, well, you're going to have a 3DS XL anyway. But if you're not planning on doing that and you just want a solid console that has a long, past and kind of a decent future ahead of it, this console can play all of the games from many, many generations of consoles. And on top of that, if you're able to mod your 3DS, which I actually did mod my 3DS XL, not my original 3DS, but my 3DS XL I was able to mod, and that console had an amazing experience. I had an amazing experience with that console when I modified it. I was able to play tons of games, lots of emulators, and there's a lot of capability, I will tell you, with a modded 3DS XL. If you want to go down that route, then that's awesome. But even if you don't want to go down that route, you have a large array of games you can choose from. I mean, even stemming back to, original New Super Mario Bros., you can go to Super Mario 64, Animal Crossing, but you also had all the 3DS games, which really kind of improved in the graphical standpoint. You had a lot of Legend of Zelda games. You had that Animal Crossing, which was really cool. You had New Super Mario Bros. That came out for this game. You even have a Super Smash Bros. That came out for this console as well. So that in and of itself is actually really impressive. And when I look at these specific consoles, right, and I look at, it was kind of the ending point of this specific 3DS genre, I kind of look at this console and I kind of see it being one of the better consoles you can buy in terms of a handheld experience, mostly because of the backwards compatibility. Its main competitor for the most part was the PS Vita. And that console, although it had its, lifespan and it had a really, people had a really good experience with it, I still look at something like the 3DS XL, and I think this is the better console. It had a huge array of games and library of games you can play at beforehand, which the PS Vita kind of didn't have. I mean, it had a different, game slot than the PSPs, so that kind of messed things up a little bit. But with the 3DS XL, with the gaming library, with its cost being what it is now, with its backwards compatibility, with its price tag, I kind of do think that getting something like a 3DS XL is a really smart choice. If you're somebody who doesn't really have any console right now, getting a 3DS XL in pretty good condition, I think is a really smart choice, just because it's going to last for quite a bit of time. Now, it's not necessarily the first device I would recommend buying. I mean, if you can, I would recommend just buying a Nintendo Switch, and because you can pretty much play, the emulators for 3DS games on a lot of different PCs. But I still think with something like the 3DS XL, it sits at a really interesting spot where it's still completely worth it. I think it still has a long future ahead of it, but the gaming library of this thing is almost unmatched for a lot of consoles, at least in the portable standpoint. So I will definitely tell you, I love the 3DS XL. I think it's still completely worth it in 2022, and I would probably highly recommend you guys to pick up this console as well. So that kind of covers it up for the most part. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section as well. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.